The crown never touched her head. It hovered just for a moment, close enough that Sharon felt the cold weight of it in her chest before it ever moved. Close enough that, for one treacherous heartbeat, hope breathed, then it shifted and landed on someone else. The crowd erupted. Torches roared against the iron sky, their flames bending and whipping in the mountain wind like living things driven mad by what they'd just witnessed. The ancient stone walls of Ironhold Keep trembled with the noise of it, warriors striking their chests, wolves lifting their voices to the dark clouds overhead, elders nodding with the quiet satisfaction of men who had already known the outcome before the ceremony began. Sharon didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there in the mud, rain soaking steadily through her navy cloak, the dark one with the silver clasp she wore, because it was the only thing she owned that felt like armor, with one small hand in each of hers, watching the man she loved lower a crown onto her stepsister's golden hair like it was the simplest decision he had ever made. Bianca knelt beautifully. Of course she did. She lowered her head with that practiced grace she had always possessed, that effortless elegance that had always made Sharon feel like something half-finished standing beside a completed portrait. The white ceremonial gown pooled around her on the stone dais, untouched by the mud that covered everything else. The crown settled into her hair like it had always belonged there. Alpha King Aaron's face stayed stone. Not cold stone. There was a difference Sharon had learned over years of watching him. Cold meant something was being hidden. Stone meant a decision had already been made, and the man who made it had locked the door behind him. She had seen that look before. She just hadn't understood, until now, what it meant for her. On her left, little Mira pressed closer, 4 years old, her small brown cloak soaked through at the hem from every puddle she'd stepped in on the walk from the cottage. On her right, Callum stood with his chin lifted slightly, the way he always did when he was frightened but was trying very hard not to show it. 6 years old, and already so much like his father it split Sharon's heart clean in two. She held them both tighter. And then, in the middle of the roaring, in the middle of the fire and the noise, and the wild celebration of a pack welcoming its new queen, Aaron's eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, not to Bianca, not to the six-pack representatives watching from the stone platform to his left, not to the elders, to Sharon, to the three of them standing at the outer edge of the crowd, where the torchlight barely reached, where the mud was deepest, where the shadows began. He found her the way he always had without searching, as if some part of him always knew exactly where she was. Their eyes met. 3 seconds. That was all it lasted. 3 seconds in which something moved across his face, something she couldn't name, something that looked almost like grief, almost like an apology, almost like the word "forgive me" spoken in a language that had no sound. Then he looked away, back to his queen, back to his choice, back to the world he had decided to build without her in it. Sharon's fingers tightened around the children's hands. She turned. No final look, no last glance at the dais, at the crown, at the man whose children she had spent 6 years raising while he built walls she hadn't understood until tonight. She turned and she walked steadily, quietly, one child on each side, 3 sets of footsteps, disappearing into the wet grass at the edge of the crowd. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called her name. Nobody even looked. But somewhere behind her, deep in the mass of celebrating wolves, one figure had gone very, very still. And they were smiling. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. The rain had come to the Ironhold Mountains like it always did in late autumn, without warning and without mercy, in great silver sheets that turned the highland paths into rivers of black mud and made the ancient keep look like something rising from the bottom of a cold, forgotten sea. It had been raining for 3 days by the time the crowning ceremony began. The pack elders had murmured about it in low voices, exchanging careful glances across the great stone courtyard as the preparations were made. A crowning held in rain was not unheard of, but 3 consecutive days of it, starting the very morning the invitations were dispatched across the 7 territories. That was something the older wolves felt differently. That was not weather. That was the mountain speaking. That was something ancient and indifferent registering, in the only language it possessed, its quiet protest. Nobody cancelled the ceremony. Sharon had stood at the outer edge of the crowd, exactly where she always stood at gatherings like this, far enough back to see everything, close enough that no one would think to look at her. She was wearing the navy cloak, the dark one with the silver clasp at the collar, because tonight, more than any other night she could remember, she had needed to feel like she was wearing something that could protect her. Not from the rain, not from the cold, from the thing she already knew was coming, because Sharon had known, not today, not yesterday, but for months, in the quiet accumulation of small and terrible signs, she had known. She had seen it in the way conversations died the moment she entered a room, in the way Bianca had begun appearing at Aaron's side during council gatherings where Sharon had once stood, in the way Aaron's eyes, when they found hers lately, carried something that looked less like love and more like a man watching a fire he had already decided to let go out. She had understood, long before the crown moved, what the crown's movement would mean, and so she had prepared. The bags were packed, the route mapped, the children's travel documents folded into the inner pocket of her cloak, next to her heartbeat. She had been ready. What she had not been ready for, what no amount of preparation could have armored her against, was that for 3 seconds, in the middle of everything, he had looked at her like he was sorry, and she had almost stayed. The cottage door was already open when she reached it. She hadn't left it that way. Sharon paused in the threshold, Mira's hand still in hers. Callum pressed against her side and listened to the silence inside, with the particular attention of a woman who had spent years learning to hear what wasn't said. Nothing moved. She stepped inside. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The bags behind the loose floorboard beneath the hearth. The children's drawing still pinned crookedly to the wall beside the window. The small wooden horse Callum had carved with Aaron's knife last winter, sitting on the shelf like nothing had changed, like the world outside was not reshaping itself into something unrecognizable. Sharon looked at it for a long moment. Then she lifted the floorboard. "Are we going on an adventure?" Mira asked, watching her with enormous, serious eyes. Sharon smoothed her daughter's damp hair back from her forehead. "Yes," she said quietly, "we are. Will Papa come?" The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "Not this time," Sharon said, and she began to move. The first sign had been so small she had almost talked herself out of believing it. 3 months ago, a Tuesday morning, grey and unremarkable, the kind of morning that didn't announce itself as the beginning of anything. Sharon had walked into the great hall to collect Callum from his reading lesson with Elder Marin, and the conversation happening between 2 senior pack warriors, a conversation that had been, from the sound of it, neither quiet nor careful, had stopped. Not slowed, not shifted, stopped, the way sound stops when a door closes on it. Both men had turned, offered her the kind of smiles that are really just shapes made by mouths, and found reasons to be elsewhere within 30 seconds. Sharon had collected Callum, walked back to the cottage, settled Mira down for her afternoon sleep, and sat at the small wooden table by the window for a long time, very still, listening to the rain on the roof. She had told herself it meant nothing. She had almost believed it. The second sign was Bianca. Not any single moment, nothing so clean and confrontational as that. It was an accumulation. The way her stepsister had begun appearing at Aaron's side during the evening councils Sharon was no longer invited to. The way Bianca laughed during those gatherings. That particular laugh she'd had since childhood, bright and carrying, designed to be heard from across a room. The way Aaron's posture changed in Bianca's presence, not softening exactly, but unlocking. Some tension leaving his shoulders that Sharon had not realized, until she saw its absence, had always been there when he was with her instead. She had watched this for weeks before she allowed herself to name it, and even after she named it, she had stayed. That was the part she would carry the longest, she suspected. Not the betrayal, not the ceremony, not the crown, not the 3 seconds of eye contact that were apparently all she had been worth at the end. The part she would carry was the staying. The 6 weeks between understanding and leaving, in which she had woken up every morning and made breakfast and braided Mira's hair and listened to Callum read aloud from his lesson books and quietly, methodically, built her escape while some stubborn, foolish piece of her heart kept whispering that she was wrong, that she had misread it, That he would come to the cottage one evening and sit across from her at the small wooden table and say something that would make the world make sense again. He never came. She kept building. The money had been the most delicate part. The pack's household accounts flowed through Elder Rendell's office, and Rendell noticed everything not out of suspicion, but out of the particular obsessive tidiness of a man who had managed pack finances for 30 years and considered irregularities a personal affront. So Sharon had been careful. Small amounts, spread across weeks, withdrawn under the cover of ordinary household expenses, supplies for the cottage, medicine for the children's winter colds, replacement boots for Callum, who destroyed footwear at a rate that had long since stopped surprising anyone. 50 silver marks here, 30 there. Enough, accumulated quietly, to disappear. The documents had come through a contact she would never name, a woman in the lower territories who asked no questions and accepted payment in the same careful, untraceable increments. New names, travel papers that would pass inspection at every checkpoint between Ironhold and the southern border. A life on paper that Sharon had built in secret, in the stolen hours after the children slept, by candlelight at the table where she had once imagined a different future. She had mapped 3 routes out of the territory, memorized all of them, identified the guard rotations on the southern path, the one that ran behind the keep's outer wall, through the tree line, down to the valley road, and noted, with the particular attention of a woman who had grown up invisible in rooms full of important people, that the guards on that path never looked toward shadows. They never thought to. Nobody ever thought to watch the woman they had already decided didn't matter. Now, in the cottage, Callum stood beside the packed bag Sharon had pulled from beneath the hearth and watched her with those careful dark eyes of his. "You knew," he said. Not a question. He was 6 years old, and already far too perceptive, this boy. Another thing he had inherited from his father, that she couldn't decide whether to be proud of or heartbroken by. "I suspected," Sharon said, which was both true and not. "For how long?" She didn't answer immediately. She checked the documents again, a habit now, not necessity, and smoothed the oilcloth wrapping around them before tucking them back against her chest. "Long enough," she said finally. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then, with the gravity of a child processing something too large for his years, "He should have told you." Sharon stilled. She looked at her son, his small jaw set, his cloak still damp at the shoulders, his father's eyes holding something that looked remarkably like indignation on her behalf. Something in her chest cracked open, very quietly, and then sealed itself back shut. "Come here," she said. He came. She pulled him close, pressing her lips briefly to the top of his head, breathing him in rain and wood smoke and childhood. Because that was the thing she understood now, standing in the wreckage of a life she had once believed was hers. Aaron hadn't betrayed her today. He had made his decision long ago, in some private moment she had never been invited into. Today had simply been the day the world was allowed to see it. She had already grieved. What remained now was simpler. What remained was forward. "Ready?" she asked. Mira appeared in the doorway, her small bag clutched in both hands, her expression solemn with the importance of the moment even if she didn't fully understand it. "Ready," Callum said. Sharon straightened, picked up her bag, and without looking back at the candlelight, at the drawings on the wall, at the small wooden horse on the shelf, she walked to the door. Outside, the rain had eased to something quieter. A mist more than a storm now, soft and gray, wrapping the valley in the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. Sharon looked at the path ahead, then at the children beside her. Then she moved. The southern path was exactly as she had memorized it. Narrow, unpaved, running along the back wall of the keep where the torchlight from the ceremony didn't reach, where the celebrating crowd's noise became something distant and almost unreal, a roar muffled by stone and rain and the particular indifference of the dark. Sharon moved along it without hesitation, one hand holding Mira's, one hand holding Callum's, her bag across her back, her boots finding the ground, with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had walked this route in her mind so many times that her body simply knew it now. Mira didn't speak. Callum didn't either. They had understood, both of them, in the way children understand things that adults believe they are hiding, not through explanation but through atmosphere, through the particular quality of their mother's silence, that this was not the moment for questions. This was the moment for keeping up. She had gone back to the cottage first, not for long. She had allowed herself exactly the amount of time it took to lift the hearthstone, retrieve the documents and the money pouch, check that everything was where she had left it, and re-shoulder the bag she had packed and repacked 3 times over the past 2 weeks to ensure nothing unnecessary remained. That was all she had meant to do. But then Mira had tugged her sleeve and pointed at the wall beside the window, where the children's drawings were still pinned, a small gallery of crayon and charcoal accumulated over years. Trees and wolves and lopsided houses. A yellow sun that Mira had drawn approximately 40 times because yellow was her favorite color and she saw no reason to draw anything else. Callum's careful, earnest attempts at horses, which had improved enormously over the past year and which he was quietly proud of, in the way he was quietly proud of most things. Sharon had looked at them for a moment longer than she'd intended. Then her eyes had moved, almost without her permission, to the shelf. The bracelet sat where it always sat, at the shelf's far left corner, coiled like a small sleeping thing. Silver, simply made, with a single stone, the color of deep water, set into the clasp. Aaron had pressed it into her hand the morning after Callum was born, before the world had begun its slow and quiet rearrangement, before she had understood what kind of man he was choosing to become. For keeping you both safe, he had said. For everything. She had worn it every day for 4 years. She had stopped wearing it 6 weeks ago, when she began to understand that she would be leaving it behind. Sharon looked at it now, really looked, for the last time, and felt something move through her that was neither grief nor anger, but some third thing that lived between them, nameless and necessary. Then she turned away. Some things you left behind, not because they meant nothing, but because carrying them would slow you down. The guard rotation on the southern path changed on the hour. Sharon had timed the departure accordingly. She moved the children through the gap in the outer wall, a place where 2 stones had shifted slightly over decades of mountain weather, leaving a space just wide enough for a woman and 2 small children to pass through sideways and into the tree line beyond without breaking stride. The trees swallowed them immediately. Behind her, through the stone and the distance, she could still hear the celebration. Wolves howling, warriors celebrating, a pack welcoming its new queen with the full weight of its voice. She didn't stop. The forest path was dark and soft underfoot, the rain filtering down through the canopy in irregular drops that tapped against the hoods of their cloaks. Callum matched her pace exactly, his small face set with concentration. Mira stumbled once on a root, righted herself before Sharon could react, and kept walking with a dignity that, under different circumstances, would have made Sharon smile. They walked for 20 minutes. Then the trees thinned, and there it was. The carriage stood in the small clearing beyond the tree line, exactly where she had arranged it. Dark painted and unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that belonged to nobody in particular, and therefore attracted no attention on any road in any territory. The horse was bay, compact, built for distance rather than speed. The driver sat on the box with the stillness of a man who had been well paid and understood that his payment included an absence of curiosity. He didn't look at her face when she approached. He didn't ask her name. "Where to?" he said quietly, his voice carrying no further than it needed to. Sharon settled Mira onto the seat first, then Callum, then climbed in herself. She pulled the door shut, sat for one still moment in the darkness of the carriage interior, her bag on her lap, her children pressed against either side of her, the distant sound of the celebration, finally too far away to hear. She looked straight ahead. "Anywhere he won't find us," she said. The driver's shoulders moved in a small nod. The wheels began to turn, and just like that, Sharon vanished. Behind her, the lights of Ironhold Keep burned against the mountain, dark, torch-bright, and celebratory, completely unaware that something irreplaceable had just walked out of its gates and into the night. Nobody had noticed. Nobody had looked. But somewhere in the crowd, one figure had slipped away from the celebration and was already moving. The final words of the binding rite had barely left Elder Rendell's mouth before Aaron moved. Not quickly. He didn't need to move quickly. He was the Alpha King, and the particular authority he carried meant that people stepped aside before they understood they were doing it, parting around him the way water parts around stone. He descended the dais steps with the same controlled stillness he'd worn through the entire ceremony, his ceremonial cloak still clasped at his shoulders, and walked directly toward the keep's inner gate without slowing. Behind him, he heard Bianca say his name. He didn't stop. He heard the elders murmuring that particular low register of men recalibrating their understanding of an evening they had believed they understood completely. He heard Kale, his beta, fall into step behind him at a careful distance, silent and professional in the way Kale was always silent and professional, which Aaron was grateful for tonight more than most. The celebration continued without him. It barely noticed he was gone. The cottage door was open. He saw it from 20 yards away and understood what it meant before he reached the threshold. Not because he was perceptive, though he was, but because some part of him, a part that had been quietly dreading this particular outcome for weeks, recognized it immediately. The specific quality of a door left open not through carelessness, but through departure. The way the light inside was wrong, too still, too uniform, undisturbed by movement or breath or the ordinary beautiful chaos of two small children occupying a space. Aaron stepped inside. The silence hit him the way silences do when they replace something that was never quiet, not like an absence but like a presence of its own, thick and particular, filling the cottage with the specific weight of everything that was no longer in it. No fire in the hearth, no scattered boots by the door, no half-finished cup of something on the table, no book left open on the chair, none of the small, ordinary evidence of a life being lived. Just a room. Just walls and furniture and the faint smell of wood smoke from a fire that had been out for hours. He stood in the center of it for a long moment. He had imagined this. In the weeks since the decision had been made, since the threat from the north had hardened from rumor into certainty, and the choice had narrowed down to one terrible option, he had imagined the range of her possible reactions. Anger, confrontation, tears, though Sharon was not much given to tears, which he had always known and respected. He had imagined her waiting here, ice-quiet and unapproachable, for an explanation he was not yet permitted to give. He had not, somehow, fully imagined this. The simple fact of her absence, the completeness of it. His eyes moved across the room with the involuntary thoroughness of a man searching for something to hold on to, and that was when he saw it. The drawing was pinned to the wall beside the window, slightly crooked, the way Callum pinned everything with great confidence and imprecise execution. Crayon on rough paper, the lines, the generous, unself-conscious lines of a child who draws not to represent the world accurately, but to record what matters in it. 3 figures holding hands. A woman, tall, with long orange-red lines for hair. 2 children, one on each side. Aaron looked at it for a long time. He looked at the space where a 4th figure might have stood at the right edge of the paper where there was nothing. Just white space, just absence, and felt something give way inside him. Not dramatically, not with the kind of violence that announces itself. Just a quiet internal collapse, the way a structure fails when the thing it was built around is no longer there. His jaw tightened. He reached out and straightened the drawing. Then he turned. Kale was in the doorway. He had followed at a distance, as he always did, and was now watching Aaron with the careful, measured attention of a man who had served his alpha for 12 years and knew exactly when to speak and when to simply be present. "She's gone," Aaron said. His voice came out quiet. Level. The particular flatness of a man keeping something contained by force of will alone. "Yes," Kale said. "How long?" Based on the fire, Kale moved to the hearth, crouched briefly, pressed the back of his hand to the ash. 4 hours, maybe 5. She left before the ceremony ended. Aaron absorbed this. "She didn't run blindly," he said slowly. Not a question, something closer to a realization arriving fully formed. "The fire's been out for hours. The cottage is cleared." She took the children's cloaks, their documents. His eyes moved to the shelf. Stopped. She left the bracelet. He didn't explain why that particular detail mattered. He didn't need to. Kale rose to his feet and said nothing, which was the correct response. Aaron looked at the drawing one more time. At the 3 figures. At the deliberate, careful space where he was not. She planned this, he said quietly. For weeks, she knew, and she planned, and she waited, and she left the moment she had what she needed. Something moved across his face that was not quite grief and not quite pride, but occupied the complicated territory between them. She planned this better than I did. The silence in the cottage settled around them both. Then Aaron straightened. The stillness in his expression shifted, not warming, but sharpening, focusing. The look of a man who has finished feeling something and is now deciding what to do about it. "Find her," he said. Quiet, careful, dangerous in the specific way that understatement is dangerous. Cale nodded once, already turning, already thinking. "I'll need to examine the perimeter, the southern path." "I know which path," Aaron said. Cale paused, looked at him. "So do I," Aaron said. She knew I'd know. She went anyway. A long beat. That means she has enough of a head start that it didn't matter. That means she was more prepared than I gave her credit for. He crossed to the doorway, stopped beside Cale without looking at him. "Don't underestimate her," he said. "Not even for a moment." Outside, the mountain wind moved through the dark tree line, carrying with it the last fading echoes of the celebration from the keep above. Cale crouched at the edge of the southern path, reading the ground with the focused attention of a man trained to see what others missed. 2 sets of small boot prints, one larger set, moving quickly but not frantically measured, purposeful, controlled. He followed them to the tree line, followed them through, and found, in a small clearing beyond the trees, the fresh tracks of carriage wheels leading south. He stood and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked back toward the keep, where his king was waiting. "She didn't run," he said quietly, "to no one. She vanished." The message had arrived on a Tuesday. Aaron remembered this, with the particular precision of a man who has replayed a moment so many times it has worn grooves into his memory. A Tuesday in late autumn, grey and unremarkable. The kind of morning that didn't announce itself as the beginning of anything. He had been in the war room reviewing the northern border reports when Cale had entered without knocking, which Cale never did, which meant Aaron had already understood, before he looked up, that whatever was coming was not ordinary. The letter had no signature. It didn't need one. Lucien Varkos of the Northern Territories was not the kind of enemy who announced himself with violence. That was what made him dangerous. Lesser rivals came at you directly with armies, with ultimatums, with the kind of aggression that at least had the decency to show you its face. Lucien came at you the way cold came into a room, gradually, from every direction at once, until you realized too late that the temperature had already changed. Aaron had been watching him for 2 years. Patient, strategic, methodical, in the way of a man who understood that the most durable victories were the ones built slowly, from the inside out. Lucien had spent those 2 years doing what powerful men do when they want something they cannot take by force. He had gathered information. He had mapped the Ironhold territories with a surveyor's precision. He had identified supply lines, political allegiances, the fault lines running through the 7-pack council. And somewhere in that process, he had found something more useful than any of it. He had found Sharon. The letter had contained 3 things. A photograph taken from a distance, slightly blurred, but unmistakably Sharon, walking the market road in the lower village, with Mira on her hip and Callum at her side. The kind of photograph that said, "I have been close enough to touch them without your knowledge." A second photograph. The cottage, shot from the tree line. The window lit from within. 2 small shadows, moving behind the glass. And 7 words. "Crown her, and I take her." Aaron had read those 7 words 11 times, standing at the war room table, while Cale waited in silence. He had read them the way you read something you already understand, but cannot stop hoping you've misread. Then he had folded the letter carefully, set it down, and stood very still for a long moment with his hands flat on the table, and the whole shape of his future rearranging itself around him. The thing about impossible choices is that they are rarely, in practice, as symmetrical as they appear. Crown Sharon. Make her queen. Give her the title, the visibility, the undeniable public confirmation of what she meant to him, and hand Lucien Varkos a weapon with a target already painted on it. A queen could not be hidden. A queen could not be made invisible. A queen was, by definition, exactly the kind of asset an enemy used to break a king. Lucien had been explicit. He had surveillance on the cottage. He had people in the crowd at pack gatherings. Aaron had found 2 of them over the following weeks, removed them quietly, found 2 more to replace the ones he'd found. The reach was deeper than he'd understood. The threat was not theoretical, or he could do the other thing, the devastating thing. Crown Bianca. Give Sharon nothing. Make her, in the eyes of every pack representative and northern spy watching the ceremony, simply a woman who had been passed over. Unremarkable. Unchosen. Not the king's weakness, just a woman with children, living in a cottage at the edge of the estate. Not worth Lucien's attention. Make her invisible. Keep her alive. He had spent 3 days making this decision. In the end, it had not felt like a choice at all. It had felt like the only door in a room that was otherwise solid wall. What he had not accounted for what he had, in his careful tactical thinking, catastrophically underestimated, was Sharon herself. He had modeled her reaction as grief, as withdrawal, as the kind of quiet, contained devastation he knew she was capable of, which would keep her in the cottage, keep her off Lucien's map, keep her exactly where his protection could reach her without Lucien understanding it was there. He had not modeled this. He had not modeled a woman who had seen it coming months before it happened, who had been building her exit in careful, invisible increments while he was building her protection, who had interpreted his silence not as a shield but as a verdict and acted accordingly. He had protected her from Lucien, and in doing so, he had driven her directly out of his reach. Now Aaron stood at the cottage window, looking out at the southern tree line, at the dark where Cale's tracks had led and the carriage wheels had turned, and Sharon had disappeared with his children into a landscape that offered no guarantees. "I tried to protect her," he said. The words felt inadequate, mechanical, the kind of sentence that was technically true and morally insufficient in equal measure. Cale said nothing. "I made her invisible to Lucien," Aaron continued quietly, and in doing so, he stopped. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. "I drove her into the open," he finished. The silence that followed was the kind that didn't offer absolution. It simply waited to see what he would do next. Cale had been tracking wolves for 20 years. He had tracked rogues through mountain passes in midwinter, hunted deserters across 6 territories, followed trails gone cold by days, and still found what he was looking for at the end of them. He was, by any reasonable measure, the best tracker in the Ironhold pack, and he knew it with the quiet, undemonstrative confidence of someone who has simply never encountered evidence to the contrary. Sharon was making him work harder than anyone he had ever followed. She had changed carriages at the first valley town. He found the original driver 2 days into the search, a taciturn man in a river settlement who confirmed, with minimal persuasion, that he had dropped a woman and 2 children at the southern crossroads just before dawn and been paid enough not to remember it. Cale examined the crossroads, read the ground, and established that she had waited less than 30 minutes before a second vehicle had collected them. She had prearranged it. He stood at the crossroads for a moment, recalibrating. She had not hired 1 carriage. She had hired 2, the first to create a trail anyone following her would expect, the second to dissolve it. She had understood that a tracker would find the first driver eventually, and had accounted for it. The handoff at the crossroads was designed to be found. It told him where she had been, and nothing whatsoever about where she was going. It was, he thought, with something approaching professional admiration, an extremely clean piece of misdirection. He went back to the maps. She was moving in irregular intervals. Not randomly. Cale was too experienced to confuse irregular with random. Random had no internal logic. What Sharon was doing had logic. It was simply logic designed to defeat pattern recognition. She moved for 2 days, stopped for 1, moved again. She varied her direction deliberately, trending south overall, but with enough lateral movement that any pursuer trying to project her trajectory would have multiple plausible destinations to divide their attention between. She was not running. She was navigating. Kale began tracking her behavior instead of her trail, and found it considerably more revealing. She favored towns large enough to be anonymous, but small enough to have limited guard presence. She avoided pack-affiliated inns. He could see this in the negative space of her route, in the establishments she had demonstrably passed through without stopping. She was paying in cash, using a name he hadn't yet identified, keeping the children close and quiet, and presumably coached on what not to say to strangers. She was, he reported to Aaron on the fourth evening, thinking like an operative. Aaron had looked at the maps for a long time and said nothing. 3 weeks out, she stopped moving. Kale identified the pause through a contact in a border town, a woman who ran a modest lodging house and recalled, with enough specific detail to be credible, a quiet, red-haired woman and 2 children who had taken a room for what was supposed to be 2 nights. They had stayed for 6. He traced the reason on the 7th day through a local apothecary's records. A purchase of fever medication, children's formula, the particular combination of remedies that indicated not a minor cold but something more serious, something that required rest, something that could not be walked through or carriaged through or strategically managed. Callum, he suspected. The boy had the build of a child who pushed himself past his limits without complaint. In the lodging house room, Sharon sat beside her son in the dark and watched him sleep. His fever had broken that morning finally, after 4 days of the particular helpless terror of watching a child's body fight something you could not fight for them. He was pale and thinner than he should have been, and currently sleeping with the total physical commitment of someone reclaiming lost ground. And she had not left his side for more than 20 minutes at a stretch since it began. The plan was 6 days behind. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that a perfect escape was a theoretical construct, that the real world would insert its complications at the moments it chose without consulting her timeline. She had known this. It was different, knowing it in the abstract, versus sitting in a dark room in a town she hadn't intended to stop in, listening to her son breathe and calculating, for the 100th time, how much the delay had cost her. What would Aaron do? The thought arrived, as it had been arriving for days, with the involuntary persistence of long habit. What would he do to find me? What does he know about how I think? She turned it over carefully. The way you turn over a problem you cannot afford to get wrong. He knew she was methodical. He knew she planned. He knew she would avoid the obvious routes and the pack-affiliated stops and the predictable destinations, which meant Kale because it would be Kale. It was always Kale would be tracking her behavior, not her trail. She needed to change her behavior. She looked at Callum's sleeping face. In the morning, she decided. When he was stronger, they would move differently from here. 200 miles north, Kale pinned a new marker to the map and stepped back. Aaron watched from across the table. She's been stationary for 6 days, Kale said. Unplanned stop medical, I think. One of the children. He paused. She'll move again soon. And when she does, she'll move differently than before. Why? Because she'll know the delay cost her. Kale looked at the map, at the careful, irregular pattern of Sharon's route across it, at the negative space where she wasn't, and the logic of where she might go. She's been anticipating us from the beginning. Every move she's made accounts for what we'd expect next. He turned to face Aaron. She's not running, Kale said. She's anticipating us. She's been 3 steps ahead since she left. A pause. We need to stop following her route. We need to follow her thinking. Aaron looked at the map. Then think like she thinks, he said quietly. Kale nodded slowly. That, he said, is what concerns me. The town was called Myreford. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 unremarkable hills, the kind of place that existed in the spaces between more important places. No pack affiliation, no strategic value, no reason for anyone with power or ambition to look at it twice. A market town, essentially. Practical and unromantic, with a weekly grain exchange, 2 modest inns, a healer's practice above the candle shop, and the particular atmosphere of a community that had been minding its own business for so long, it had elevated the practice to an art form. Sharon had chosen it for exactly these qualities. They had been there for 3 weeks when she began to feel safe. She recognized, even as it happened, that this was dangerous. Safety was a feeling, and feelings were not intelligence. But Callum's color had returned, and Mira had found a tabby cat that lived behind the baker's and visited it every morning with solemn devotion. And Sharon had secured work, helping the healer with her records, 2 mornings a week. Nothing that required her real name, nothing that drew attention, nothing that couldn't be walked away from in under 10 minutes, if the situation required it. For the first time since the ceremony, she had slept through the night. She should have known that was the moment to move. The first time she saw him, she didn't register it consciously. A man standing at the corner across from the market, tall, dark-coated, still in the particular way that men are still when they are watching something rather than simply waiting for something. She had noted him with the peripheral automatic attention she applied to everything now, filed him under unremarkable, and moved on. The second time was 2 days later. Different corner. Same stillness. Same coat. Or one identical to it. Sharon bought her vegetables, kept her pace exactly as it was, and did not look at him directly. The third time, she looked. He was already looking at her. Not quickly, not furtively, he held her gaze for a full 2 seconds with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who was not concerned about being seen. Who perhaps, she thought with a coldness beginning to spread through her chest, wanted to be seen. Who was making a point of it? She took Mira's hand and walked back to the lodging house without varying her pace. Inside, she stood at the window at an angle where she could see the street without being visible from it, and waited. He appeared at the corner opposite within 4 minutes. He stood there for a while. Then he left. That night, Sharon sat at the small table after the children were asleep and thought very carefully. Aaron's trackers would not do this. Kale's people were professionals. They observed without being observed. They gathered information without announcing themselves. They certainly did not make sustained eye contact with the person they were following. If Ironhold had found her, she would not know about it until they wanted her to, which meant this was not Ironhold. She turned this over in her mind with the steady, controlled attention of someone who cannot afford to panic and has therefore made the practical decision not to. She thought about the route she had taken from the crossroads. The lateral movements, the irregular stops, the careful avoidance of every territory she associated with pack politics and power. She got up and found the map she kept folded in the inner pocket of her bag, the one she had marked with the routes she had taken, the stops, the directions. She spread it on the table, looked at it, and felt the cold spread further. The southern route, the lateral movements, the final approach into the valley. She had been so focused on avoiding Ironhold territory, on moving in directions Aaron would not expect, on the sophisticated geometry of not being found by the man she knew, that she had not sufficiently accounted for the man she didn't. She had studied Aaron's maps. She knew Ironhold's borders, its allied territories, its surveillance patterns intimately. She did not know the Northern Territories the same way. She looked at the map again, at the valley, at Myreford, sitting quietly in its shallow bowl between 2 unremarkable hills. At the borderline, she now realized she had crossed 6 days before she arrived here, while she was focused on Callum's fever and the lodging house and the apothecary and everything except where, precisely, she was. The Northern Territories. Lucien Varkos's land. She had not escaped into neutral ground. She had walked, with her children and her careful plans and her meticulously mapped route, directly into the territory of the one man Aaron had been trying to hide her from. Sharon folded the map, set it down, sat very still in the dark of the small room while her children slept behind her, breathing the slow, trusting breaths of people who believed she had this handled. She thought about the man across the street, the deliberate eye contact, the patience of someone who had already decided there was no hurry. He's not hunting me, she realized. He's waiting. He already knows exactly where I am, and he's simply waiting. The bracelet she wasn't wearing, the crown that had landed on the wrong head, the choice Aaron had made that she had interpreted as abandonment and run from, directly and efficiently, into the hands of the person that choice had been designed to protect her from. Sharon closed her eyes briefly. "I didn't escape," she said quietly, "to the dark, to no one. I walked into his hands." She waited 2 days. Not out of hesitation, she had made the decision the same night she had spread the map on the table and understood where she was. But she spent those 2 days watching the man across the street with the careful, systematic attention of someone building a complete picture before they act, his patterns, his shifts, whether he was alone or part of something larger, whether the waiting was personal or orchestrated. By the second evening, she had counted 3 of them. They rotated in pairs, never the same combination twice, always at least one visible and one not. Professional, patient. The surveillance of people who had been doing this long enough to be bored by it, which was somehow more frightening than urgency would have been. Urgency meant a deadline. This had no deadline. This was simply a net, drawn closed around her, waiting for her to notice she was already inside it. On the 3rd morning, while the children were still asleep, Sharon took the burner phone from the bottom of her bag, the one she had sworn, when she packed it, she would not use unless there was no other option remaining, and typed a number she had never written down because she had never needed to. She had known it by heart for 6 years. She typed 3 words. "They found us." Then she set the phone on the table and looked at it and breathed. The reply came in 40 seconds. "Where are you?" she told him. Then she set the phone face down, went to the window, and watched the street below with her arms folded and her jaw set, and the particular composure of someone who has made a decision they cannot unmake, and is now simply waiting for the consequences of it to arrive. He came in 36 hours, alone. No guard detail, no pack escort, no ceremonial anything. Just a single horse, and a man who had clearly not slept in the better part of 2 days, arriving at the lodging house door in the grey early morning, while the town was still quiet, and the man across the street had not yet taken his post. Sharon opened the door before he knocked. They looked at each other across the threshold. He was thinner than she remembered, or perhaps it was the exhaustion, which sat on him with the settled weight of something that had been accumulating for weeks rather than days. His eyes, when they found hers, held something she didn't have immediate words for: relief and grief, and something rawer than either. The expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has not yet decided whether he is allowed to put it down. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. The children were awake by then, and the first 5 minutes were Mira launching herself at Aaron with the total physical commitment of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned to be complicated about love, and Callum standing slightly apart, watching his father with those careful dark eyes, and Aaron crouching down to hold them both with his face pressed into Mira's hair, and something moving in his expression that Sharon made herself look away from. When he stood again, she sent the children to the back room with their breakfast. Then she turned to face him. "You chose her," Sharon said. Her voice came out level. She had practiced nothing, but her voice came out level anyway, which was perhaps simply what happened when grief had enough time to cool into something harder and more manageable. Aaron shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I chose to keep you alive." And then it came out. All of it, in the flat, careful voice of a man recounting a tactical situation he is still not fully at peace with. Lucien Varkos. The letter, the photographs, the surveillance on the cottage, on the children, on every ordinary morning she had spent at the market or on the village road while someone she couldn't see was watching and cataloguing and waiting. Crown her, and I take her. Sharon listened without moving. He told her about Bianca, about how he had believed, and here his voice shifted slightly, something tightening in it that the arrangement was simply political, that he had missed, until recently, the evidence that Bianca had known, that the warmth she had shown toward Aaron during those council gatherings had not been purely opportunistic, but informed that Lucien had a closer channel into Ironhold than a few photographs through a tree line suggested. Bianca, it appeared, had been part of the architecture of it. Sharon absorbed this, She thought about her stepsister's graceful acceptance of the crown, the practiced composure of it, how a woman who knew what was coming would look, standing on that dais. Exactly like that. When Aaron finished, the room was quiet. Sharon stood at the window with her back to him for a moment, watching the street below. Not because anything was happening, but because she needed somewhere to direct her eyes while she sorted through the complicated interior weather of being told that the worst night of her life had been, in its terrible way, an act of protection, not forgiveness. She wasn't there. Not acceptance. That was a longer road than 36 hours allowed. She turned around. "You should have told me," she said. 3 words that contained everything: the 6 weeks of building her escape in the dark, the ceremony in the rain, the 3 seconds of eye contact that she had interpreted as goodbye, the map spread on the table in this small room in enemy territory. All of it, distilled. Aaron held her gaze. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain further. He simply took the words and held them, which was, she thought, the correct response. "Yes," he said. "I should have." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was not resolved. It was the silence of 2 people who have more to say to each other than the current situation permits. Standing in a room in a town that belonged to their enemy with 2 children in the next room and a net closing steadily around them, Sharon straightened. "The man across the street," she said. "There are 3 of them, rotating pairs. They haven't moved yet, which means they're waiting for something, an order, or a better opportunity." Aaron nodded. Already shifting. Already reading the situation. "We need to move tonight," Sharon said, "before they change pattern." Agreed. She looked at him across the room. This man she had loved, and left, and found again in the wreckage of his own protection. This king who had made the wrong right choice, and the right wrong choice, and was standing in front of her now with no crown and no guards, and 36 hours of sleeplessness on his face. "Survival first," she said. "Everything else later," he finished. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. They moved at 3 in the morning. Sharon had chosen the hour deliberately, the deepest point of the night, when the town's rhythms were at their most predictable and the rotating pairs outside would be at their most fatigued. She had been tracking the pattern for 2 days, and she knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent weeks learning to read surveillance the way other people read weather, that the window between the 2nd and 3rd rotation was the longest gap in their coverage. 11 minutes. That was what she had. She woke the children without turning on the lamp. In the particular way she had learned over months of movement, a hand on each small shoulder, gentle but deliberate, a finger to her lips before their eyes were fully open. They had learned, both of them, to wake without sound. This fact lodged somewhere in Sharon's chest with a weight she didn't examine. She examined it later. Right now she moved. Aaron had said nothing when she laid out the route. Not because he had no opinions, she could see them moving across his face, the tactical assessments, the alternative calculations, but because he had looked at her map, at the notations she had made over 48 hours of careful observation, at the gap she had identified and the route she had plotted through it, and understood that she had done the work, that she knew this ground better than he did. He had simply nodded. "You lead," he said. She had not expected that. It had cost him something. She could see not his pride, exactly, but the deep-grained instinct of a man whose entire life had been built around being the one who determined the path. He had set it aside, cleanly, without ceremony. She had filed this away in the part of her that was not yet ready to feel things, to be examined later. They moved in single file through the lodging house's back passage. Sharon first, then Callum with his hand in Aaron's, then Mira tucked against Aaron's chest, her small face pressed into his shoulder, her eyes wide and dark and trusting above the line of his arm. The alley ran behind the market buildings, parallel to the main road, narrow enough that 2 people walking abreast would have had to angle their shoulders. Sharon had mapped it 4 days ago, walked it twice in daylight under the cover of ordinary errands, noted the exit points, the sight lines, the places where the shadows were deep enough to matter. They were 40 yards from the far end, 40 yards from the side street that led to the valley road, to the horse Aaron had left at the far stable, to the route north that she had already planned in 3 variations, depending on what the next 10 minutes required. When the 2 figures stepped out of the dark and blocked the path ahead, Sharon stopped. Behind her, she felt Aaron's hand move instinctively toward her, and she was already thinking, already reading the geometry of it, the angles and the distances and what was behind them and what was in front, and what the 11-minute window had just become. The 2 men didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their positioning said everything spread wide enough to cover the alley's full width, close enough that going around was not an option. They had anticipated the route, not guessed anticipated, which meant Lucien's people had been better than she had accounted for, or she had a gap in her pattern she hadn't identified. It didn't matter now. What mattered was the next 30 seconds. Sharon turned. Aaron was already looking at her, reading her face with the focused attention of a man who has just understood that the situation has changed and is waiting to see what she decides. She looked at him, then at Callum, standing at his side with his chin lifted and his jaw set, then at Mira, still pressed against Aaron's chest, her small hand gripping his collar. Something settled in Sharon's chest. Not calm, exactly. Something beneath calm, something older and more absolute. She stepped toward Aaron and put her hand on his arm. "Take them," she said. "Sharon, the gap is still open behind us. 40 seconds, maybe less." Her voice was low, level, leaving no room for negotiation. "You know the route to the stable. Go. I'm not leaving you. You're not leaving me." She held his gaze. "You're taking our children out of this alley. There is a difference. A beat. Go. Now." Something broke and reset in his expression in the space of a single second. Then he moved because he understood, as she had understood looking at the map on the table 3 nights ago, that some decisions were not about preference, but about what the situation required. He moved past her with the children, back the way they had come, his footsteps quick and quiet on the wet stone. Sharon turned to face the 2 figures at the end of the alley. They were watching her with the patient, faintly amused attention of men who considered what was about to happen a formality. She let them think that. For 6 years, she had stood in the background of her own life, quiet, careful, invisible by necessity. She had stood in the rain at the edge of a crowd and watched and said nothing. She had built her escape in stolen hours by candlelight and fled through shadows and survived by being overlooked. She was done being overlooked. The first man moved forward. Sharon moved first. Behind her, growing fainter with distance, she heard small boots on wet stone. Mira's voice, just once, very quietly, quickly hushed. Then nothing. They were out. Sharon didn't look back. At the alley's far entrance, in the grey beginning of dawn, the 2 figures had underestimated her, in the specific, fatal way that people always underestimated quiet women by assuming that quiet meant incapable. They learned otherwise. On the valley road, Aaron ran with Callum's hand in his, and Mira against his chest, and his heart hammering with something that was not quite fear and not quite prayer, but lived in the narrow territory between them. He did not stop. He did not look back, because she had told him not to, and because for the first time in a very long time he trusted her completely. She had been the king's weakness. Now, she was his war. She took the first man down in 4 seconds. Not gracefully, this was not the choreographed combat of someone trained in a practice yard. This was the fighting of a woman who had spent 6 years being underestimated and had finally decided to use it. She moved inside his reach before he had fully extended, used his own forward momentum against him, and put him into the alley wall with enough force that the second man hesitated. That hesitation was all she needed. The second man was larger, more careful, and recovered faster than she expected. He caught her left arm and she felt the wrench of it, sharp and immediate, and used the pain the way she had learned to use everything in the past weeks as information, not interruption. She pivoted, broke the grip, and drove her elbow back with the full weight of her body behind it. He went down. She stood in the narrow alley breathing hard, her left arm aching, the 2 men groaning on the wet cobblestones around her. 30 seconds. Then she heard it boots on stone. More than 2 sets. coming from the alley's far entrance. Not the hesitant approach of men who weren't sure what they were walking into. The rapid, certain approach of men who were. Lucien had sent more than two. Sharon turned and ran. She came out of the alley onto the valley road at a dead sprint and nearly collided with the dark-haired king running back toward her. They caught each other by the arms in the grey dawn light, both breathing hard, both reading the other's face in the rapid, comprehensive way of people operating on pure situation awareness. "There are more," she said. "I know." His eyes moved to her left arm, the way she was holding it. Something shifted in his expression. "How many?" "I heard at least 4 sets of boots." Behind her, the alley mouth was still empty. 10 seconds, maybe 15. The children, safe. Kale arrived 20 minutes ago. He has them at the North Road. He was already moving, his hand on her right arm, pulling her with him. "I came back. I told you to run." "I know," he said, with a simplicity that contained no apology and no argument. Simply the fact of it, he had come back, and somehow that was more disarming than anything he could have explained. They ran. Kale was exactly where Aaron said he would be. The North Road, 100 yards past the town's last building, where a stand of dense firs created a natural blind from the road behind. 2 horses, a small covered transport for the children, and Kale himself standing at the tree line with the composed, alert expression of a man who had been tracking Sharon across 6 territories and had developed, in the process, something very close to professional respect. Mira was asleep against the transport's interior padding, exhausted past the point of fear. Callum was awake, sitting straight, his father's jaw in his mother's eyes, watching the road behind them. He looked at Sharon when she climbed in. "You fought them," he said. "Not a question." "I did." "Did you win?" Sharon looked at her son for a moment, at the careful, serious face that had been processing impossible things for months, with a grace that broke her heart on a regular basis. "We're here," she said. "That's winning." Callum considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then he nodded and leaned against her and closed his eyes. They rode north for 3 days. Not back to Ironhold, not yet. Aaron had arranged a safe location 2 territories north of Myreford, a fortified estate belonging to an allied pack whose loyalty had been tested and confirmed over 20 years. Far enough from Lucien's reach, close enough to begin the work of dismantling what Lucien had built. Sharon slept for 14 hours the first night they arrived. She woke to find Mira curled against her left side. Callum sprawled on his back across the foot of the bed with the total physical commitment of a child who has finally felt safe enough to stop holding himself upright, and early morning light coming through a window that looked out onto a quiet courtyard where nothing was threatening and nobody was watching. She lay still for a long moment, listening to her children breathe. Then she got up, wrapped herself in a wool blanket, and went to find Aaron. He was in the small study at the end of the corridor, sitting at a desk covered in dispatches. A candle burned most of the way down beside him. He had clearly not slept. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and the expression on his face, the particular expression of a man who has been sitting in the dark with his own accounting and is not yet finished, settled into something quieter. She came in and sat in the chair across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, a bird had started somewhere in the courtyard, a small, ordinary sound, the kind of sound that belongs to mornings that are not emergencies. "Bianca has been taken into custody," Aaron said finally. "She is being questioned. The extent of her arrangement with Lucien is still being established." A pause. "I'm sorry. I know she is your stepsister." Sharon considered this. The word stepsister had once meant something warm and complicated. It now meant something differently complicated. She allowed herself to feel the grief of that for a moment. Not the betrayal, which she had already integrated, but the loss of something she had once believed was hers. Then she set it down. "And Lucien?" she asked. "Cornered. His network inside Ironhold is dismantled. Without the inside access Bianca provided, his reach into our territories is effectively severed." Aaron's jaw tightened briefly. "He will not be a problem for much longer." Sharon nodded. The candle between them burned steadily. "I need to say something," Aaron said. She waited. He looked at her across the desk, and all the dispatches and the burned-down candle and the weight of the past months, and for a moment he looked less like an alpha king than like a man sitting in a small room at dawn, trying to find words adequate to an inadequate situation. "I made choices about your life without consulting you," he said. "I told myself it was protection, and it was, but it was also something else. It was me deciding what you could handle, what you needed to know, what risks were yours to take." He held her gaze steadily. "I was wrong. Not about the threat, about the method." A pause. "You deserve the truth. You deserve the choice. I took both from you." Sharon looked at him for a long time. She thought about the bracelet she had left on the shelf, the drawing with 3 figures and no father, the 6 weeks of building her escape in the dark, the ceremony in the rain, the carriage wheels turning south toward a danger she hadn't known she was driving into. She thought about the alley, about the moment she had pushed the children into his arms and turned to face what was coming, and the specific feeling of that, not fear, not heroism, just the absolute clarity of a person who finally knew exactly what they were made of. He had not given her that clarity. The months of running had. "I know why you did it," she said finally. "I understand the logic of it. I even understand that it came from love." She paused. "But you need to understand something too. I am not someone who needs protecting from the truth. I never was. I was just someone you never asked." Aaron absorbed this without flinching. "I know," he said. "If we do this," she stopped, recalibrated. "If we move forward, any version of forward, it is different from what it was. You don't make decisions about my life without me. Not ever again." "Yes," he said. "No conditions. No qualifications. Just yes." The candle flickered. Sharon looked at this man exhausted, honest, sitting in the wreckage of his own protection with every wall down, and felt something in her chest that had been locked for 6 weeks shift and begin, very slowly, to open. Not forgiveness as absolution, forgiveness as a door. She reached across the desk, not for a dispatch, not for a map. She picked up the simple silver bracelet that he had placed there. She hadn't seen him do it. Didn't know when the one with the deep blue stone, the one she had left on the shelf in the cottage. He had gone back for it. She looked at it in her palm for a moment. Then she fastened it around her wrist. 3 months later, on a morning with no rain and no ceremony and no crowd, Sharon stood in the great courtyard of Ironhold Keep and watched Callum run across the open ground toward Aaron, who caught him and swung him up with the easy physical confidence of a man learning, one ordinary moment at a time, how to be present in the life he had nearly lost. Mira sat on the courtyard steps beside Sharon, feeding small pieces of bread to a bird with the solemn, dedicated focus she brought to all important work. The keep around them was quieter than it had been. Cleaner somehow. The political architecture that Lucien had spent 2 years constructing inside it had been methodically dismantled over the past months. The council had been restructured. The allied pacts had been consolidated. The threat that had driven an impossible choice had been removed from the board with the precise, unhurried efficiency of people who had learned, at significant cost, not to leave things half-finished. Bianca had gone north. Sharon had not asked for details. Some griefs were better carried at a distance. Aaron set Callum down, said something that made the boy laugh, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the laugh of a child who has stopped holding himself upright and then looked across the courtyard at Sharon. She held his gaze, not 3 seconds this time, as long as it needed. He walked back to her through the morning light. No crown, no ceremony, just a man crossing a courtyard to stand beside the woman he had protected badly and loved well and was learning, with her patience and her honesty and her absolute refusal to be anything less than fully herself, how to deserve. He sat beside her on the steps. Mira, without looking up from her bird, climbed immediately into his lap. They sat together in the quiet morning, the 4 of them in the ordinary, extraordinary light of a day that was not an emergency, not a ceremony, not a crisis, just a beginning. "No more secrets," Sharon said. "No more secrets," Aaron said. Below them, Callum had found something in the courtyard grass. and was examining it with the intense, scientific focus of a 6-year-old who has decided this is the most important thing in the world. The bird ate bread from Mira's hand. The keep was quiet, and Sharon, who had stood in the rain and said nothing, who had built her escape in the dark, who had walked into enemy territory and fought her way back out and refused, at every turn, to be reduced to something manageable. Sharon leaned back against the warm stone of the home she had chosen to return to, and let the morning be enough. Some women are broken by the story they are handed. Some women rewrite it entirely, and some, the quiet ones, the ones nobody thinks to watch, become the reason it ends well. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.